Greetings. Okay, so we're still in the section on spirit. This is a diversion, as usual. And I'm going to talk about Hegel and the West. That means the Wild West of America. So, in the very first video in this video series, I said this. The biblical flood is the beginning of history. Nature is savage and unpredictable. So unpredictable that the flood almost wipes out humanity. Noah does a deal with God. God will protect us from nature if we follow his rules. Paradoxically, because we are still bits of nature, we still have the savagery, the hostility, and the unpredictability within us. So God tells us that if we are able to control the nature within, then he will control the forces of nature outside us. So I want to illustrate this idea with a look at the American West. And why? Because our idea of what is good ethical behavior and what is bad changes. So when I was a kid, everyone played cowboys and Indians. We played out, and really what could be described as glorifying genocidal tropes for settler colonialism. And it wasn't me personally did this, it was just the game, everyone was playing it. And I wasn't even living in America. So what was the power of the West, and why did it catch on even with young kids? And what does it tell us about today, if anything? Because it should tell us something, given the fact that it was like common practice, even in the consciousness of children, to play act this film genre. Okay, so morality is never abstract. And when you hear people being abstract who say, I just love humanity, they either don't understand or there's usually something else at work. Okay, I mean, we all love humanity, but when people abstract that and put it at a higher level, when someone in particular is suffering, then there are problems. Okay, so the United Nations says this, Article 1. It declares all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. We aren't born with rights. Rights are social, not natural. They're a product of a certain type of society, the Western society. Doesn't mean Western's better, it means they arose at this particular time. So while we see the settling or the colonizing of and the occupation of the American West as a kind of Protestant endeavor, yeah, God-fearing, Bible-bashing Protestants is usually what's behind the, the door of the family home. So in many cases, they came from Northern Ireland as well. And they were at the forefront of the settlement of the American frontier. The idea of transforming nature, it's also a Fichtean idea from the German philosopher, whose breakthrough idea was the I, transforming the not I. Okay, humans transform the world out there. So the American pioneers wanted to be protected from the unpredictability of nature by taming nature. So you tame something by controlling something, and a way to control something is to colonize it. The word colonize means to occupy and to take control. The Mormons, they were the specifically American brands of American Protestant Christianity. And they did have it all. They had pioneering spirit. They traveled to the furthest reaches of the wilderness, and they brought it under the control of God's children, and they even mapped out Salt Lake City as a replica of the Middle East of Israel. So the Mormons found that Joseph Smith had been brought up in a household at a time when the savagery and unpredictability of nature joined forces in 1816 to create what was described as the year without a summer. This was the coldest winter on record and resulted in disastrous crop failures. Smith lived through this natural disaster in an area of America that was exceptionally literate and exceptionally Protestant. The 1816 famine for Smith was like a biblical event, like the flood of Noah, which is why I quoted that thing at the beginning. So law was God's demand to Noah and Abraham. Law meant a break from nature and traditional family and clan relations. Obey the law was God's command, even unto sacrificing your own son. Okay, so it meant forget family, forget everything, follow me. So in return, the chosen people would receive God's protection. So for American Protestants, faith was the foundation, and a sign of God's favor would be good works. Good works were a result of the faith that God had given them. It was up to God's children to earn His grace by showing their industriousness. So to prove their piety, they had to work on themselves, as we said previously, and they also had to work on nature, which was the evidence of their piety. So the Mormons were following in the footsteps of the English Puritans, who themselves had left England in the 1630s, which brings us to Hollywood and Hollywood Westerns, and why they held people in their cultural grip for so long, and why today have they all but disappeared. And if they do survive, why have they become revisionist? And do Westerns still tell us anything about the Hegelian concept of forgiveness, which is in this section on spirit? We haven't reached religion yet. So when I was a kid, as I said, we used to play cowboys and Indians, Native Americans, I beg your pardon. They were always called Indians. So we played it on the street. I had sets of cowboys and Indians, like model figurines, and they were all frozen in different like postures. So the cowboys would be usually shooting rifles or have a gun, and the Indians would have tomahawks. Sometimes they'd have rifles, and they'd have these elaborate Indian headdresses. So you could even paint these models. So again, what was a boy from Bootle doing? Play acting, imaginary war scenes, you know, in reality, scenes of atrocities. So when they took place, these on the other side of the planet. So all the kids as well did it, as I said. Hollywood Westerns, they weren't just big box office in the US and the UK. They were an art form so culturally dominant that they entered the fabric of our society down to the minds of small children. And again, I keep asking the question, why were they so popular, which I'll try and explain now. So the fact that they managed to successfully travel to Europe is one thing. I mean, it's sort of, I've got a very deflationary explanation, but it's still not very good. But the success in the USA, certainly, that's something that makes up, it's the second video in the series on Hegel and forgiveness. So although the famous or infamous towns of the American frontier, they weren't as violent as we suppose, nevertheless, there was a serious absence of law and order because the reach of what we call Western civilization didn't extend beyond the frontier. So leaving aside the Native Americans for one moment, the citizens of the new lands had to figure out how to improvise and how to manage the worst excesses of lawbreakers by hiring gunmen or lawmen to enforce the law. This is important in philosophical terms because lawlessness represents nature in Hegelian philosophy and the Hegelian order of things. Our natural inclinations also represent nature, and therefore the brigand or the outlaw acting on his or her inclinations, usually his, is just as much part of the natural world as the landscape is. It's the natural part of us that we need to control just as much as we try to control natural events such as fire, flood, storms, so on. And the natural part of us is also represented in film by the Native Americans. They're called savages in the films, but even in the civilized white European settler male fold, this European white males have this aspect of savagery within them, and they've got to master it in the same way as the wild frontier, as without. So it's the same thing. Nature within is the same. Sorry, the nature within us is the same as wild nature, the frontier. So Protestant pietists believe that they were shaping their souls by shaping the world. Let's see the last videos. So, okay, on the beautiful soul. So the Fichtean Enlightenment postscript and the development of this idea of pietism was this I and not I. So I'm going to get slightly technical and a bit highfalutin here. So right in the late 18th century, Fichte's I is a so-called self-producing process. It shapes the rest of the system through its self-positing activity. This self-positing activity of the I is a form of self-determination, and this in turn forms the reflective self-consciousness, even I'm getting confused here, the reflective self-conscious activity of the I. Okay, in plain English, our activity, our mental activity shapes the outside world, and it shapes us too at the same time. So it's a lot like pietism, only without God. The rule of law is not only following God's command, its result is also human mastery over nature. The natural urges of within and the natural forces of without, that's nature. Our urges are natural urges. The American homesteader, with his axe in his hand, resting on the plow, that's the embodiment of this mastery of external hostile nature in an image. So the lawman was the embodiment also of the mastery over the natural and the savage part of our inner nature. So on the one hand, you got the guy with his axe, he's building fences and taming nature and ploughing the land. On the other hand, you got the lawman who's trying to contain the nature within us in a lawless society. So the lawman of the West wasn't the product of an overactive German philosopher's imagination, like Victor, and it wasn't the result of Protestant preaching. The lawman of the West was a real thing. Even if he became mythologized, there were these people, there were these ferocious individuals who struggled with, as we call them, the bad guys. So what was the relationship between the lawman and the ideal of the rule of law? Okay, these lawmen, like city marshals, they did tread a fine line between keeping order in an unruly town filled with bars and bordellos and doing the bidding of the merchants, the bar owners who financed them, because the merchants, the bar owners, the petty bourgeoisie, they needed law and order. This bourgeois society rests upon this abstract law and order. There's no question about that. Okay, so some of the lawmen were good, some were bad, and most were ugly. Do you like my reference to the rest in there? Okay, and a number were actually probably outright psychopaths. But the most famous lawman of them all, let's take him, Wyatt Earp. So he was officially described as a liar and a pimp in court documents. He was also described as a lowlife. I'm not too sure how accurate that is because he denied it, but that's what the court record says. One aspect and one driver of the American West was the cattle industry. So the enormous American cattle industry needed open spaces, open ranges, and if we take the town of Abilene, for example, in the Wild West, in 1869, the town council made it illegal to carry a deadly weapon inside the city limits, and signs displaying this ruling were shot to pieces, and the town jail was demolished by the cowboys. So cowboys, that word was originally and initially a pejorative term for cattle herders who worked on ranches. Cattle drives meant moving cattle huge distances to new pastures to safeguard the herd's health and then move them on to market. And often cowboys would just smash up a town for fun. Abilene therefore needed law and order, and the city fathers sent for someone called Bear River Tom Smith. Smith had tried to keep law and order in the town of Bear River in Wyoming. Bear River was actually burnt to the ground, and I don't think anything of that original settlement remains today. People were lynched by vigilantes, and many people died, were just murdered. And Smith enforced the law, even though he was unsuccessful, he enforced the law best that he could. And in Abilene, he enforced the law using his fists. I think it's called buffaloing, where he picked someone up on the head and turned them upside down. He closed down red light districts without using a gun. And during Smith's tenure as a lawman, he didn't kill anyone. Smith himself was shot and decapitated with an axe when he fought two men. And he's got a grave today, Google it, and it's marked a fearless hero of frontier days who in cowboy chaos established the supremacy of law. Anyway, after Smith's death, Abilene appointed Wild Bill Hickok. Wild Bill quickly became a dime novel hero in his own lifetime and admitted that he'd only killed 36 people in his career. The Wild West moved west as the frontier and the industry moved west. So we've got things like the Lincoln County Wars in New Mexico. And that was two groups of people who were competing for profits from dry goods and cattle, clashing. And that involved William Bonney, most famously, is known as Billy the Kid, and he killed 21 people apparently. The city of Dodge gave us the term Red Light District, and that was the name of one of its brothels, the Red Lighthouse. Dodge was famous in the American psyche for its lawlessness. I think there's a series on it, isn't there? A modern TV series. So the force of nature, the powerlessness of people, and the fragility of social life also intruded into the cities. So far from the American frontier, and 4 years after Bear River was burned to the ground and torched, the city of Chicago was practically burned to the ground in 1871. 9 square kilometers of it were destroyed. So even in a city, that wasn't by cowboys, that was just because they were built out of wood. But even in a city, a huge city like Chicago, not that long ago, humanity, we were very far from mastering the savage forces of nature, and a match or a stray light could wipe out a town. Another aspect of American colonization of the continent was the arrival and expansion of the homestead. At the same time as towns like Bear River were being burned to the ground, between 1863 and 1890, nearly 1 million people filed homestead applications. Homestead Act of 1862 was a law that allowed citizens to claim 160 acres of public land, it was called, in exchange for a small fee. Claimants were required to live on and improve their plot by cultivating the land. And this amounted to 10% of American land. So there was a political party, the Free Soil Party, which promoted this policy that would later, this Free Soil Party merged with the Republican Party, and it opposed slavery. It had Presbyterian roots. The Homestead Act also resulted in tensions between settlers and indigenous Americans, partly due to settlers moving on to indigenous territory while it was still occupied. So settlements frequently meant Indian removal and culminated in multiple wars waged by settler militia against indigenous Americans. I mean, that's kind of the pop history that we all know. So even when the law was still under debate in the US House of Representatives, the long-time advocate of homesteading, Galusha A. Grow, great name, of Pennsylvania, he promised the scheme would create, this is what he says, great empires of free states built on the ruins of savage life. Grow was the 24th Speaker of the US House of Representatives. His politics was interesting. Here's a quote. All the citizens ask of his country and his government is to protect him against the cupidity of soulless capital and the iron grasp of the speculator. Upon his wild battlefield, these are the only foes that his own stern heart and right arm cannot vanquish. While then the shield of this government is thrown over the moneyed interests of the country, fostering by your protective laws, its associated capital withhold not justice from the men who go forth, single-handed and go alone, to subdue the forest, tame the savages and the wild beast, and prepare in the wilderness a home for science and a pathway for civilization. Okay, so he's anti-capitalist. He says he doesn't like capital, which is interesting. So, we've got to put things into the historical perspective and say these are much more complicated than we think. So during the homestead period, America did little to stop the displacement of native peoples, and Enlightenment ideas such as those of John Locke were also influential in this homestead movement. Locke thought that people were entitled to claim private property from nature through their labour. His ideas were influential, and he proposed that agricultural improvement was a consequence of this conquest of nature. Locke wrote, "Through the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person." Okay, so far. Right, this nobody has any right to but himself, the labour of his body and The work of his hands, we may say, are likewise properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature that had provided and left it in, he has mixed with his labour with it. He has mixed his labour with it and joined it to something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So this is a labour theory of value, really, prior to Marx. So before the Homestead Act, Americans have been encouraged to settle in Native American areas and to form militias to keep them in check. We explained this. So the conquest of the Seminole Nation is a good example. Many were ethnically cleansed from Florida and deported to Oklahoma. The intention of the Homestead Act of 1862, though, it wasn't to make settlers conquer Native American land, but frequently this was its outcome. Even though settlers could not forcibly take native land without it being bought by the government officially, homesteaders often settled in indigenous land. Although only a small proportion of the settlers staked claims on this land, overall, the Homestead Act should be seen as part of the conquest of the native lands and their transfer to white ownership, white Americans. That's quite clear. Most of us would accept that. In February 1867, the Indian Commission described a sudden overflowing of the whites throughout the Indian country caused by the discovery of gold and silver and the rapid settlement of the Western Territories. The commander of the military division of the Missouri complained in October 1867, public lands have been surveyed and sold, railroads and stage roads located, and telegraph lines with their necessary offices and stations established in a country where Indian title is clearly recognized. So even at an early stage, official America recognized that this land was being stolen and not doing anything about it. The Homestead movement would also come quickly into conflict, not just with Native Americans, but also with big cattle owners, and result in the end of the open plain. And it also meant war. Frederick Nolan, in his book The Wild West, says, Charles Goodnight in Texas, Alexander Swan in Wyoming, or John Chisholm in New Mexico. Chisholm, John Wayne. By right of possession and determination, backed by a force of well-armed cowboys, vast tracts of land on which their stock roamed and which they were less than willing to let the homesteaders file upon. The economics of the cattle industry required the open range to remain open. The arithmetic was simple. Each cow needed up to 10 acres of open range and access to water. A herd of 80 to 100,000 head of cattle required anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million acres. As a result, its owners would strenuously oppose the incursion of settlers. Feuds or wars between cattlemen and homesteaders or sheepmen or warring families could go on for ages. In Montana and New Mexico, feuds would rage for years till people forgot what it was about. Feuding and revenge was a feature of a land without law. The nature of law, the law of the strongest, prevailed, of course. And revenge, as Hegel says, and we come to it time and time again, that's a natural act. By that I mean it's an equal and opposite reaction to an action. So forgiveness is hard. That's a human act in Hegelian fashion. So it's supposed to overcome this natural fact of revenge. And we're going to talk about it later on why this is important in the West and in the films that mythologize this area. Okay, the so-called Lincoln County War ran from 1870s to 1883. The Horror War was basically an ethnic conflict that went on for a year. In the vast, sparsely populated West, outlaws and vigilantes would just do whatever they wanted, and revenge, they'd go hand in hand. And a lawman, by the way, was no necessary guarantee of the law. Often the lawman failed, as in the case of Tom Smith, and he'd be killed. And so vigilantism was common, not just on the open range, but also in Gold Rush, California, where killing the owner of a gold claim was a way to inherit that claim. So in the year 1855, there were 47 lynchings in lawless California. And that's going to bring us to the next video, Hegel and the Western movie, which is part 2 of the video on forgiveness. So that's a bit about the Wild West first. See you next time.